It is somewhat difficult for me, as a person who is well informed about policy issues and current events, and as a person with close friends and family that have been negatively impacted and have their lives interrupted by the policies of this administration. It's difficult for me to not just respond with anger and hatred upon learning that somebody that I know is a Trump supporter. Knowing the truth about Trump, I can only conclude that these people must either be evil or ignorant. Um, if they are evil, then there isn't much that I can do about that. Um, if they are ignorant, which is to say uninformed but not idiots, then they are merely supporting Trump because they are lacking certain relevant information. Um, since some of these people do not seem to be bad people, I can only conclude that these people have been misled. That they simply lack certain information and would almost certainly reject Trump in a heartbeat if they knew all the facts. Nevertheless, the media on both sides has been withholding the relevant information. Um, so I have decided to compile a comprehensive list of what I consider to be the evidence against Trump that makes the case that he is an extremely bad president. Um, so I have made a nonpartisan case against Trump, putting all the cards on the table and making all the facts known. Uh, the purpose of this series of videos is to explain the concrete ways in which Trump's policies harm us, and which is to say, the ways in which Trump's policies harm everybody, um, and to show how these policies negatively impact our lives. And I also want you to understand uh, that Trump's agenda really will destroy lives, and that Trump is an immoral and corrupt individual. Um, so we are the people who are harmed by Trump's agenda. It's hard for us to not just hate Trump supporters and turn our backs on all the people we know who have embraced Trumpism. It's not just us, but it's the Trump supporters themselves that are negatively impacted and harmed by Trump's agenda and policies. Hopefully, by the end of this series of videos, you will understand why I say this. For us, politics is a matter of life and death. And Trump's policies are putting our safety in jeopardy. Our lives have become precarious, unstable, and insecure. We have no idea whether we'll make it through the next 6 years. This isn't hyperbole or exaggeration. And yet, some of our friends and families support the agenda of this regime that is threatening our lives. I'm left wondering how these people who claim to care about us, can so adamantly support politicians whose policies may actively harm or even kill us. And yes, Trump's policies absolutely will result in human lives being lost. People I know and care about could die as a result of the agenda Trump is pushing. Nevertheless, these people who pretend to care about us are supporting this agenda that could kill us. I honestly feel like a Jew living in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. My hope is that this compilation of the best evidence for the case against Trump is sufficient to convince the viewer to change their mind about supporting Trump. This is no partisan critique. I am neither a Republican nor a Democrat. My politics are hard to categorize in terms of right and left. On the one hand, I oppose capitalism and support some egalitarian policies, but on the other, I also oppose insurrection and unnecessary revolution. My views don't align with any political party. I was at one time a conservative libertarian and a Ron Paul supporter, I was a traditional conservative in the tradition of Edmund Burke, um, and a libertarian in the tradition of F.A. Hayek. And I saw no conflict between these positions. I was a hardcore Christian with theological influences ranging from fundamentalism, Calvinism, and presuppositionalism to Eastern Orthodoxy. As a result of my religious views, I ended up drifting. Towards anarchism, as anarchism seemed to logically follow from the radical libertarian spirit of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Eventually, I ended up studying the epistemology of science and studying Darwinism, and I ultimately became an atheist. At which point, I drifted towards left libertarian anarchism. After years of studying political philosophy and economics, I now identify as a civic Republican, a Georgist, and a distributist. And my views at the moment really align closely with those of Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. Here, in these videos, I am putting forth a critique of Trump that is drawn from many traditions, like traditional conservatism, libertarianism, anarchism, and social democracy, all of which come from outside of American partisan politics. I was and still am a staunch critic of both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, so I'm not singling out Donald Trump. There is a massive amount of evidence to suggest that Trump is likely a rapist and a pedophile. These range from allegations against him, disturbing comments that he has made himself, and his own admission to certain types of inappropriate conduct. For instance, he has made numerous disturbing comments of an incestuous and pedophiliac nature with regard to his daughter Ivanka. In 1997, when his daughter was 16 years old, he said, quote, "Don't you think my daughter's hot? She's hot, right?" End quote. On another occasion, he said, quote, "If Ivanka weren't my daughter, perhaps I'd be dating her." End quote. In an interview with Howard Stern, he agreed with Stern that it would be appropriate to describe Ivanka as, quote, "a piece of ass," end quote. There have been no less than 20 allegations of sexual assault and misconduct against Trump, many of which are proven to be true by his own admission. After talking about how his own daughter is a piece of ass, Trump stated that he would never pass up an opportunity to have sex with a woman, and then bragged that he was often allowed to get away with walking in on naked girls in the dressing room while at beauty pageants. Additionally, he has bragged about being able to get away with sexually assaulting women, saying, quote, "I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the pussy," end quote. These statements made by Trump are extremely relevant in light of the numerous allegations against him. Here's a list of some of those allegations. Jessica Leeds alleged that he grabbed her breasts and tried to put his hand up her skirt. Ivana Trump alleged that he raped her. However, she is no longer allowed to speak about the incident due to a non-disclosure agreement. Jill Harth alleged that he pushed her against a wall, grabbed her breasts, grabbed her genitals, and tried to rape her. Kristen Anderson alleged that he grabbed her genitals. Lisa Boyne alleged that he made the female models stand on the table, and then he looked up their skirts and commented on their underwear and genitals. Kathy Heller, Jennifer Murphy, Rachel Crooks, Natasha Stoynoff, and Temple Taggart all alleged that he forcibly kissed them against their wills, Jessica Drake alleged that he not only forcibly kissed her, but also asked her how much when she rejected him, and he implied that he would pay her for sex. Melinda McGillivray and Nini Laaksonen alleged that he grabbed their butts. Maria Bellato claimed that he walked in on naked girls as young as 15 years old in the dressing room. The same allegation was put forth by Bridget Sullivan and Tasha Dixon on separate occasions. And also, I'll remind you that the walking in on the girls in the dressing room at the pageants was something that Donald Trump himself admitted to doing and bragged about. Summer Zervos alleged that he forcibly kissed her and put his hand on her breasts. Karina Virginia alleged that Trump touched her breasts. Cassandra Searles alleged that he grabbed her butt and invited her to his hotel room.
A staffer that used to work on the set of The Apprentice alleged that Donald Trump used to snort Adderall on set. He also corroborated the stories about Donald Trump walking in on underage girls in the dressing room at the Miss Teen pageants. And he also alleged that on at least one occasion he overheard Trump offering an underage girl the opportunity to win the pageant in exchange for sex.
These incidences span from the 1980s all the way to 2013. What is really disturbing, though, is that the allegations are mostly for things that he is on record bragging about doing. More disturbingly, there are allegations that Trump raped a 13-year-old girl. Donald Trump had the following to say about his sex offender friend, Jeffrey Epstein. Quote, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." End quote. It is now known that Epstein was running a large sex trafficking operation during those 15 years in which he was friends with Trump. It is known that Epstein was pimping out underage girls to wealthy businessmen and politicians. The initial investigation revealed that Epstein had sexually victimized around 40 underage girls in Florida. Epstein was tried, convicted, and is now a registered sex offender. One of Epstein's sex slaves was a 15-year-old girl that he picked up when she was working at Trump's Mar-a-Lago Beach Club as a changing room assistant. He kept the girl in servitude for years and loaned her out to his wealthy friends. This particular girl, whom he picked up at Mar-a-Lago, was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew on 3 separate occasions. It is worth noting that Epstein is not the only billionaire friend of Trump's to have been taken down for sex trafficking involving minors. His business associate, Tefik Arif, was arrested in 2010 and charged with running a sex trafficking ring with girls as young as 16. A woman named as Katie Johnson filed a lawsuit alleging that she had been trafficked by Epstein and was raped by Donald Trump in 1994 when she was just 13 years old. However, the case was unlikely to go anywhere because the statute of limitations had already passed for the crimes allegedly committed by Trump. The court would have had to allow for an exception. The case was further complicated by Trump's election to the office of president. The lawyer gave up on the case, citing the extreme difficulty, if not impossibility, of getting a sitting president to testify, arguing that the legal battle was no longer worth the effort. Furthermore, the plaintiff had started receiving death threats and was thereby intimidated into giving up rather than trying to find a new lawyer. Given that he walked in on naked 15-year-old girls in the locker room, that he sexualized his own 16-year-old daughter, and was close friends with 2 people who were busted for running child sex trafficking rings, it really seems likely that this allegation that Trump raped this 13-year-old girl who was trafficked by Epstein was true. Trump has many ties to racketeers, mobsters, drug dealers, and organized crime. As a young man, Donald Trump became friends with Roy Cohn, a lawyer and fixer for the heads of the Genovese and Gambino crime families. One of Cohn's staff recounts that Donald Trump met with Fat Tony Salerno, the head of the Genovese crime family, on at least one occasion at Cohn's townhouse. Trump contracted companies owned by Anthony Salerno and Paul Castellano, the heads of mafia families, to construct Trump Tower and Trump Plaza. Salerno was later convicted and sent to prison for racketeering. The construction of Trump Tower was used as evidence to prove that Salerno's company was part of a racketeering enterprise. It appears that Trump worked with John Cody, a teamster associated with the Gambinos, in order to keep unions from interfering with the construction projects. In exchange for keeping the union from holding up the project, Trump helped a jobless friend of Cody's get a $3 million loan without showing financial information or filling out an application, allowing her to buy 3 Trump Tower apartments. In 1982, when Cody ordered a citywide strike, construction continued at Trump Tower. As a result of such dealings, John Cody was convicted and imprisoned for racketeering. In 1979, Trump hired 200 non-union workers, mostly illegal immigrants, to work alongside union workers for a demolition project. Ordinarily, bringing non-union workers to a union job site would have resulted in a picket. But work continued because the Genovese mafia family controlled the unions. Trump claims to have had no knowledge of the illegal immigrants working on his site, but that claim is false. According to an FBI informant who was close to Trump at the time, Trump knew about the underpaid illegal immigrants working at the site and was aware that the company he hired was owned by the mob. In 1981, when Trump decided to build a casino in Atlantic City, he was subjected to a background investigation as a requirement for getting the necessary license. Trump threatened not to invest his money in Atlantic City unless the state's attorney general limited the scope of the investigation to 6 months. Furthermore, Trump illegally refused to disclose federal grand jury inquiries that he had been involved in. The disclosure of 2 such investigations related to possible crimes involving his business dealings would have barred him from being able to receive the license. Then there is Trump's friend Joseph Weisselbaum, a drug trafficker who was indicted on charges of trafficking cocaine and marijuana, who eventually got taken down on embezzling charges. Weisselbaum ran Trump's personal helicopter service. During the trial, Trump personally vouched for Weisselbaum's character, and he had a job waiting for him when he was released from prison. Immediately after release, Weisselbaum moved into a Trump Tower apartment worth $2.4 million. There is no record of money ever having changed hands for the purchase of the apartment. Trump's association with Weisselbaum technically ought to have cost him his license, though regulators decided to look the other way. Trump once acquired a mob-owned property from Salvi Testa and Frank Narducci Jr., who were hitmen working for Nicky Scarfo of the Scarfo mob. Trump ignored the principal owner and struck a lease deal on the property directly with Ken Shapiro, Scarfo's investment banker. Trump had initially agreed to lease the property at an inflated price. But the Division of Gaming Enforcement objected to Trump having mobsters as his landlord, something that could have cost him his license to operate a casino. So rather than lease the property, Trump bought it and paid over $1 million for a 5,000 square foot lot that was only worth $195,000. The purchase of this land was a cover for an illegal payoff to the mafia. Mayor Michael Matthews went to prison for his involvement in payoffs to the mob, but the FBI reports that Trump was involved in those payoffs via Shapiro went uninvestigated by the Casino Control Commission. Felix Sater, a Russian mobster, was a senior advisor to Donald Trump as of 2010. And he was asked to testify in court on Trump's behalf in 2008. Sater is a Russian mobster who has done time for stabbing someone in the face and has also been convicted for mafia-orchestrated fraud. Sater's Bayrock Group, with which Trump has done a lot of business, has ties to the Russian government, as several people at Bayrock are connected to the Kremlin. Sater frequently visited with Trump over the course of 6 years, flew to Colorado with him, and escorted Trump's children around Moscow during a Russia trip. Trump retained Sater as a close associate well after Sater's role in organized crime became public knowledge. Trump was even personally aware of Sater's association with organized crime, as members of the press had asked him for statements about it. Trump's inner circle in the White House is still dealing with Felix Sater, who co-authored a plan that Trump's attorney hand-delivered to Michael Flynn before he was removed from office. But Felix Sater isn't Trump's only connection to the Russian mafia. The Russian mafia has been using Trump-brand real estate to launder money for 3 decades. In 1984, David Bogatin, an infamous Russian mobster, met with Donald Trump and bought 5 condos in Trump Tower for $6 million, which would be equivalent to $15 million in today's money. And he did this in spite of apparently having no way to pay for them. These condos were later seized by the government because they were used for money laundering. When Trump was billions of dollars in debt and his business wasn't going well, the Russian mafia bailed him out. Over a dozen people with links to the Russian mafia have lived and conducted illegal business out of Trump's properties, using his casinos to launder dirty money. In 2008, Donald Trump Jr. said the following: "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia," end quote. When we start talking about Trump's association with Russian mobsters, we start segueing into the whole Trump-Russia collusion territory. The Russian mafia is different from American mobs. As General Oleg Kalugin, the former head of the KGB, explains, the Russian mafia is part of the KGB. It's part of the Russian government, end quote. The Russian mafia is entangled with the Russian state. Simeon Mogilevich, the head of the Russian mafia, has said the following, and I quote, "The word mafia, as far as I understand the word, means a criminal group that is connected with the political organs, the police, and the administration," end quote. In 1987, Soviet ambassador Yuri Dubinin invited Trump to Russia, and he was flown into Moscow, with all expenses paid by the Soviet state. In Donald Trump's own book, The Art of the Deal, he recounts how he discussed building a luxury hotel across the street from the Kremlin, quote, "in partnership with the Soviet government," end quote. A few years after Trump's big trip to Russia, the Soviet Union collapsed as the Russian government rejected Marxist-Leninism and started implementing market reforms. When President Boris Yeltsin privatized all the government assets, the Russian mafia ended up taking over the oil, coal, and banking industries. When Vladimir Putin succeeded Yeltsin, he formed an alliance with Simeon Mogilevich, the most powerful gangster in the world. In 1991, Mogilevich paid a Russian judge to get Vyacheslav Ivankov released from a gulag. Upon release, Ivankov went to New York. Ivankov bought a Rolls-Royce dealership to launder money and partnered with Felix Komarov, who was living at Trump Plaza. Ivankov frequented Trump's Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City, which he used to launder money. In 2015, the Taj Mahal casino was hit with the largest fine ever levied against a casino by the government, and casino management admitted that they had knowingly and willingly been violating regulations against money laundering for years. For a while, Ivankov had evaded the FBI, but when they finally tracked him down, they found out that he was Trump's neighbor living in Trump Tower. The fact that Trump Tower suspiciously allows for anonymous buyers made it more difficult to determine precisely where Ivankov was living. By the time the new millennia arrived, Trump was $4 billion in debt, financially unstable, and couldn't get any banks in the West to lend to him. Trump was facing almost certain financial ruin, but the Russians bailed him out. Tons of Russian buyers and Russia-based LLCs quickly purchased all of Trump's most expensive units. Dolly Lenz, a single real estate broker, sold 65 units in Trump World Tower to Russians. A Florida broker that sold 500 Trump apartments reported that 1/3 of the buyers were Russian-speaking. In Sunny Isles, Florida, 63 individuals with Russian addresses and passports spent $98 million on Trump brand properties. Over 700 Trump properties in Sunny Isles were bought by shell companies that conceal the buyer's identity. Among Trump's new Russian buyers was Edward Nektalov, a diamond dealer who was investigated for laundering money for the mob. When it was announced that he was cooperating with investigators, the mob took out a hit on him, and he was shot dead on 6th Avenue in broad daylight. Two other such buyers were Anatoly Golubchik and Michael Sal, who were convicted for running a Russian mafia-protected gambling and money laundering syndicate. Not only were Russians buying his Trump brand properties en masse, but Russian oligarchs even started building real estate with no monetary contribution from Trump, then slapping the Trump name on the buildings and giving Trump a huge share of the profits. Trump Soho is one such example, which was the brainchild of Sapir Organization and Bayrock Group. Sapir Organization was owned by Tamir Sapir, whose business partner was a member of Ivankov's mob. Trump described Sapir as a great friend and even hosted Sapir's daughter's wedding at Mar-a-Lago. Bayrock Group was founded by Felix Sater, who I've mentioned before. He was the former Trump Organization senior advisor to Trump, and he's the one that did time for stabbing someone and was convicted of mafia-orchestrated fraud. So Trump Soho was built by these two mob-owned companies, Bayrock Group and Sapir Organization. And Trump Soho has multiple ties to a Russian international money laundering network. In 2013, Alamzan Toktokonov, who is Simeon Mogilevich's right-hand man, appeared on live television sitting in the VIP section of the Miss Universe pageant, just a few seats away from Donald Trump. As the pageant owner, Donald Trump had one of the most powerful mobsters in the world sitting next to him in the VIP section. My contention is that Donald Trump is bought and owned by the Russian mafia, which is inseparable from Vladimir Putin's government. Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed to have no dealings with Russia, but that is manifestly untrue. The leftist case against Kavanaugh is fairly weak, focusing exclusively on the question of his moral character and the allegations against him. These are important issues and probably good reasons to oppose Kavanaugh. But the strongest case against Kavanaugh has come from the right, from traditional conservative and libertarian critics. There is a strong conservative and libertarian case against Kavanaugh. Solid arguments against confirming Kavanaugh were put forth by Fox News' own Andrew Napolitano, Representative Justin Amash, the Republican from Michigan, and Daniel Larison of the American Conservative. Kavanaugh has been accused of attempted rape, but Trump has at least 20 similar accusations against him, and Trump supporters don't seem to care, even if the allegations are true. All accounts, with the exception of Kavanaugh's own, suggest that it is quite plausible that he did rape several women. Kavanaugh's best friend from college, Mark Judge, wrote a book titled Wasted, The Tales of a Gen X Drunk, in which he recounts his drunken exploits with Kavanaugh. This book was written long before these allegations were made, but the Kavanaugh depicted in the book truly is the kind of guy who would get drunk and rape a woman. Christine Blasey Ford, her story is also corroborated by accounts from other women who attended the same parties. And she had told other people about the incident long before Trump appointed Kavanaugh to be a Supreme Court justice, although she never went to the police or tried to press charges. Which, why would she? There's no way she could have actually proved in a court that she had been raped unless she had got a rape kit done at the time that the event happened, and honestly, most women that are raped don't go that route. So it probably would have been completely useless for her to take this to the police. Ford's testimony was quite believable. Furthermore, Ford answered every question that she was asked by Congress, whereas Kavanaugh repeatedly dodged questions and declined to answer. Furthermore, Kavanaugh repeatedly lied under oath during the hearings. This might lead one to suspect that Kavanaugh had something to hide. Nevertheless, regardless of whether or not the allegations are true, Kavanaugh ought to have been rejected solely on the basis of knowingly and repeatedly lying under oath. Of course, we do not know for certain whether or not Kavanaugh was guilty. Nevertheless, any doubt ought to have counted against Kavanaugh. The hearing was not a trial, but a job interview. Kavanaugh is and was not entitled to due process. Due process does not apply to job interviews, and no one is entitled to a seat on the Supreme Court. It would have made perfect sense for Congress to err on the side of caution and refuse to confirm Kavanaugh. Furthermore, keeping him from being confirmed would in no way have been a victory for Democrats. There's a dozen other conservatives that could easily have been confirmed in Kavanaugh's place. The seat was, no matter what, going to go to a conservative. The insistence on confirming Kavanaugh betrays a lack of respect for women. Indeed, it betrays a contempt for women. If the accusations even might have been true, then he should not have been appointed to a position that will likely result in him ruling on significant women's issues. All of this, of course, It's just the standard centered left case against Kavanaugh. It's the case made by liberals every day. The conservative and libertarian arguments coming from the right wing, however, present a much stronger case against Kavanaugh. The conservative and libertarian case against Kavanaugh does not rely upon calling his personal character into question, nor does it hinge on the plausibility of the allegations against him. Instead, the right-wing critics of Kavanaugh have focused on Kavanaugh as a judge. As a judge, Kavanaugh has ruled in such a way that demonstrates that he has a very liberal interpretation of the Fourth Amendment. Furthermore, he is on record expressing this very liberal interpretation. Kavanaugh has such a loose interpretation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments that these constitutional amendments might as well not even exist. Kavanaugh's interpretation effectively renders part of the Constitution's Bill of Rights null and void. Kavanaugh simply does not believe that a warrant should be necessary for government search and seizure. He believes that government ought to be able to take your property without due process and without a warrant. This should trouble anyone who believes in private property and the rule of law. Kavanaugh's own record makes it seem almost perfect. Kavanaugh's own record makes it seem almost certain that he will always rule in favor of the government on any case involving Fourth or Fifth Amendment rights. Kavanaugh is opposed to due process and constitutional checks on law enforcement and federal agencies, and judging from his own record and stated opinions would work to undermine the rule of law as a Supreme Court justice. Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court would likely help to erode the Constitution and expand the powers of the federal government. Regardless of where one stands on politics, whether left or right, this ought to be disconcerting. Even if you trust the current administration and the people in power today, it is only a matter of time until someone else is in power. Eroding the checks on government power is not in the best interest of anyone. The powers of the federal government have already been expanded unconstitutionally by the Patriot Act, which Kavanaugh helped to create. Obama used the powers given to him by the Patriot Act to indefinitely detain people without trial, to execute American citizens via drone strike without trial, and to collect phone, email, and other records of Americans without a warrant. These powers could easily be used by a political opportunist to target their political opponents. This, of course, is all unconstitutional. However, Kavanaugh is a staunch supporter of the Patriot Act and would uphold the constitutionality of these unconstitutional practices in any case that comes before him, effectively rendering the Constitution worthless. No conservative or libertarian can support the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice who is openly hostile to the Constitution and seeks to render the Bill of Rights null and void. Trump's appointment of Kavanaugh demonstrates that Trump wishes to expand the powers of the federal government and weaken the U.S. Constitution. It is quite telling that Trump appointed an anti-Constitution extremist to the Supreme Court, especially considering that Trump himself has promised to nullify the 14th Amendment through an executive order. This, of course, would clearly be unconstitutional. Personally, I am opposed to birthright citizenship, but for entirely different reasons than Trump is. I do not believe that anyone should automatically become a citizen, even if they are born here and both their parents are citizens. I think that full citizenship should be granted to anyone who first can demonstrate a high school level of education, second, has served either in the military, law enforcement, or the Peace Corps for at least 6 years, and third, has worked and paid taxes for 6 years. Anyone who is not a criminal and can pass a background check should be granted legal residency, though not citizenship, and be allowed to work and pay taxes in the United States. With the exception of asylees and refugees, which is a very small and insignificant minority of immigrants, all non-citizens ought to be barred from receiving any taxpayer-funded benefits until they become a public servant, like a soldier, a police officer, or a member of the Peace Corps, and until they start making progress towards becoming a citizen. Under the system that I propose, the only illegal immigrants would be actual criminals, whereas all other illegal immigrants would have become legal residents, though not citizens, and would begin paying taxes into the system without receiving the opportunity of getting welfare benefits and without getting the right to vote. Trump, however, has a very different reason for opposing birthright citizenship than I do. He wants to end birthright citizenship in order to keep demographics from changing. I, on the other hand, want citizenship to be a privilege that comes with certain duties and responsibilities. While I agree that birthright citizenship, which is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, needs to be overturned, I think it needs to be done by Congress through a constitutional amendment rather than done illegally through an executive order. The fact that Trump appointed Kavanaugh, a judge known for his hostility to the Constitution, and the fact that Trump believes that he should be allowed to overturn the Constitution through an executive order demonstrates that the president is a fascist. On both counts, Trump has violated his oath of office. He swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, and now he has promised to illegally nullify the Constitution and appointed a judge that he thinks will help to trample the Constitution. I find it perplexing that a large percentage of military veterans support Trump, in spite of Trump's lack of respect for veterans. This is a president that has absolutely no respect for American veterans. Trump skipped the ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery on Veterans Day so that he could watch Fox News and rant on Twitter. This is the second year in a row that he has failed to attend the Arlington National Cemetery event. He did this a week after skipping a ceremony to honor fallen soldiers that died in World War I. Not only does he refuse to attend events honoring veterans and fallen soldiers, he publicly attacks American veterans and war heroes. Concerning John McCain, he said, "I don't like losers. He's not a war hero. He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people who weren't captured." End quote. This comment betrays a complete ignorance of McCain's story. McCain's jet was shot down over Hanoi, and he broke a leg and both arms upon impact. He was drugged ashore, beaten, impaled with a bayonet, and taken captive. He was repeatedly beaten and tortured, then placed in solitary confinement for 2 years. When McCain's father became the commander of all U.S. forces in the Vietnam theater, the Vietnamese offered to release McCain, and he declined the offer unless they would also release the rest of the POWs. At this point, they began torturing him more intensely on a regular basis. McCain is regarded as a war hero because he chose to endure torture rather than accepting preferential treatment from the enemy. In an interview, Trump baselessly attacked Admiral William McRaven, who is a decorated veteran who was responsible for the Navy SEAL raid that captured Osama bin Laden. Trump baselessly called him a, quote, Hillary backer and an Obama backer, end quote. Trump said this in spite of the fact that McRaven did not back either Hillary or Obama and has always remained nonpartisan. Then, showing complete ignorance, Trump blames McRaven for not having captured bin Laden sooner, and he even mentions how bin Laden was hiding in Pakistan the whole time. The reality is that intelligence agencies were responsible for locating bin Laden, and that McRaven was merely responsible for the raid that captured him. Trump's comments are not only disrespectful to a decorated veteran, but also demonstrate his complete ignorance of military matters. In light of which, it is manifest that Trump is incompetent and unsuited to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Donald Trump has the audacity to publicly attack veterans and war heroes, but he himself is a cowardly draft dodger. Trump successfully dodged the draft, not out of conscientious objection, which would have been admirable, but rather because he is an entitled coward who puts himself above country. Donald Trump's policies and proposals are a complete disaster. His protectionist tariffs raised prices and made it impossible for American farmers to sell their products to China. As a result of his tariffs, many companies are raising their prices to push the cost of the tariffs onto the American consumers. The tariffs are punishing Americans rather than punishing China. Here's a list of some of the companies that have either raised their prices or announced that they will be raising their prices as a direct result of Trump's tariffs. Costco, Pepsi, Walmart, Coca-Cola, Winnebago, Polaris, Whirlpool, General Motors, LG, Miller, Coors, Samuel Adams, Campbell's Soup, Toyota, Kleenex, Huggies, and Jack Daniels. In addition to harming the American consumer by raising prices, Trump's tariffs resulted in retaliatory tariffs from China. These retaliatory tariffs hurt American farmers so bad that Trump had to bail them out to the sum of $12 billion and will likely have to give them more subsidies in the near future. Trump's trade war is a disaster. China, Mexico, and Europe are imposing retaliatory tariffs on us as well. Yet Trump shows no signs of admitting his fault and backing down. It's not just agriculture and consumer products that have been devastated by Trump's tariffs. Manufacturing and construction has also been negatively impacted. GM announced that they will be closing 5 of their North American plants and laying off 15% of their salaried workforce in 2019. GM isn't downsizing, but rather shifting orientation towards manufacturing driverless vehicles. The new jobs and factories will be created outside of North America. As of October 2018, the price of diesel fuel was up 27%, asphalt was up 11%, and steel mill products were up 18% compared to the same time the prior year. Trump's 25% tariff on steel imports allowed domestic producers to raise their prices because of lack of foreign competition. New Hampshire DOT reported a 30% increase in steel prices, and Ohio DOT reported a 20% increase. The stock market is doing terrible. Trump's tax cuts caused the Fed to have to raise interest rates in an attempt to check inflation, which resulted in stock prices falling. Taxation is a monetary policy. Government issues money by spending, expanding the money supply, and absorbs money through taxation, contracting the money supply. Taxation is a mechanism for keeping inflation in check. Since taxes have been cut while government spending has not, the Fed had to raise interest rates in order to curb inflation by discouraging lending. The rising interest rate is discouraging investment, which is the reason for the downturn in the stock market. At the same time, Trump's trade war is driving up prices and producing inflationary pressure. Without raising taxes on the wealthy, which Trump refuses to let happen, there is no way for anyone in the Fed or in the government to stop inflation. This means that the average American person is actually going to pay much more taxes, but they won't even realize it. Instead of paying taxes to the IRS, you'll be hit with what economists call an inflation tax. This is where government spending is funded through inflation rather than taxation proper. The tragedy is that an inflation tax hits the poor and the middle class the hardest, whereas the wealthy are mostly unaffected because the interest earned on investments counteracts the inflation. Trump's tax cuts were effectively a tax increase for all working class Americans. To some extent, Trump's tax cuts can be seen as a revival and extension of Reaganomics. It is true that Reagan increased taxes during his time in office, but it is also true that he cut taxes on the wealthy. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 dropped the top income tax rate to 28%. Compare that to 70% in 1980. Such tax policies, although generally favored by conservatives, are economically unsound and unethical, and result in stagnating wages in spite of increased productivity. The end result is that while workers produce more, corporations and wealthy individuals end up taking more of the share of that wealth rather than raising wages for the working populace. Allow me to reintroduce an economic observation from Karl Marx. Marx observed that the capitalists and the bourgeoisie under capitalism, they have an incentive to maximize their own profits. They are motivated by their own self-interest. In a totally unregulated market, employers will attempt to maximize profits by cutting costs. This can be done by cutting wages, refusing to spend money on safety measures, etc. Consequently, in an unregulated market system, wages have a tendency to fall to the subsistence level, and working conditions tend to get worse over time. Thus, Marx predicted the immiseration of the proletariat, or the impoverishment of the proletariat, or working class. A gradual worsening of the condition of the working class, so that wages would fall until they become starvation wages, and working conditions would become increasingly worse and less safe over time. And this is actually how things played out in places like India and China, where they didn't have government regulations to prevent that immiseration. The condition of the proletariat or working class would gradually get worse as capitalism progressed. The immiseration or impoverishment is what Marx predicted would lead to the revolution. When the working class spontaneously throws off its shackles and takes over, Marx's analysis is totally correct if markets remain unregulated. However, this is not how things have historically played out here in the West. Revisionist Marxists and social democrats like Edward Bernstein pointed out that in reality, government policies tend to mitigate the negative effects of unregulated capitalism and thereby prevent such a total immiseration from occurring. Throughout Europe and America, government has imposed minimum wage laws, workplace safety requirements, social welfare programs, and progressive taxation as ways of staving off the immiseration of the proletariat. Because of such policies, capitalism ended up raising the entire populace rather than just raising the wealthy and the upper class. Minimum wage meant that wages were not allowed to drop below a certain point. OSHA meant that employers could not cut corners on maintenance and cleaning in order to cut costs and maximize profits. If working conditions became hazardous due to mold or faulty equipment, employers were required by law to rectify the situation and ensure that their employees had safe working conditions. In spite of the official government numbers, the economy is doing quite lousy under Trump. Real unemployment is up. Real wages are down. Stock prices are falling. And the national economy is not doing that well at all. While nominal wages have increased, real wages, adjusted for inflation, have not increased in decades. Furthermore, the real minimum wage, adjusted for inflation, is actually lower now than it was 50 years ago. GDP has grown, but GDP growth seems to have been driven mostly by inflation and speculation. The reality is that the metrics we use to measure the health of the economy are mostly bunk. Unemployment and GDP numbers are extremely misleading. The recession ended in June of 2009. The economy started to grow again, but the average person still feels like they're stuck in the recession. While GDP has increased since 2009, real unemployment remains high and wages have been declining. While the economy is expanding and wealth is increasing, none of it is trickling down to the people. Instead, the newly created wealth is all going to the top 1%. We are being told that unemployment is way down, but the reality is that the numbers are misleading because anyone who is not actively looking for work is not counted among the unemployed for statistical purposes. I'd like to read a passage from a book by Andrew Yang. About 1 in 6 working age men in America is now out of the workforce, one of the highest rates among developed countries. What happened to these 5 million workers? A rosy economist might imagine that they found new manufacturing jobs, or were retrained and reskilled for different jobs, or maybe they moved to another state for greener pastures. In reality, many of them left the workforce. One Department of Labor survey in 2012 found that 41% of displaced manufacturing workers between 2009 and 2011 were either still unemployed or dropped out of the labor market within 3 years of losing their jobs. Another study out of Indiana University found that 44% of 200,000 displaced transportation equipment and primary metals manufacturing workers in Indiana between 2003 and 2014 had no payroll record at all by 2014, and only 3% graduated from a public college or university in Indiana during that time period. The study noted very few went back to school, and relatively few seem to avail themselves of a lot of the government programs available to assist displaced workers. How do the 40% of displaced manufacturing workers who don't find new jobs survive? The short answer is that many became destitute and applied for disability benefits. Disability rolls shot up starting in 2000, rising by 3.5 million, with the numbers increasing dramatically in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other manufacturing-heavy states. In Michigan, about half of the 310,000 residents who left the workforce between 2003 and 2013 went on disability. Many displaced manufacturing workers essentially entered a new underclass of government dependents who have been left behind. End quote. So why do we simultaneously have growth in GDP and increase in real wealth overall, alongside declining real wages for the vast majority of the populace? Well, the answer lies in Marx's analysis of the immiseration of the proletariat and the role that government policy has in mitigating that immiseration effect. The creation of a minimum wage and safety standards kept that immiseration from increasing. But it was entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and VA programs that really helped raise the condition of the working class. Furthermore, high income tax rates on the top earners led to rising wages overall. When tax rates are high for the people at the top tend to keep less of the profits for themselves in order to avoid raising their own tax rates. Instead, they will raise the wages of their employees. When profits exceed the amount that the rentier and capitalist class can siphon off without government confiscating it via tax policy, the owners of industry will use that excess to raise wages for their employees rather than increasing their own income and thereby losing most of the money to higher taxes. The higher the tax rate on the top earners, the higher the average wages in the economy are. When top earners have lower tax rates, all new wealth goes to CEOs and other people at the top. When conservatives cut taxes on the wealthy, it causes wages to stagnate. By imposing a high income tax rate upon the wealthy, the government circumvents the immiseration of the proletariat and ensures that wages rise as productivity and wealth increases. Neoliberals and social democrats successfully discovered a means of preventing the inevitable collapse of capitalism that Marx predicted. In the 1920s and the 1950s, the economy was booming. The whole populace in America seemed to be rising from the ashes. In 1916, the top tax rate was just 15%, but that was raised to 77% in 1918. The result was the booming 20s. Wages rose throughout the economy. Since workers are also consumers, the higher wages for the workers meant more spending money for consumers. This stimulated the economy and sparked unprecedented growth. In the latter half of the 1920s, however, the government cut the tax rate for the highest earners down to 25%, which led to the disaster of the 1930s and the Great Depression. The Great Depression dragged on as long as taxes on the wealthy remained low and wages consequently remained low. World War II pulled the United States out of the Great Depression, not because war is inherently good for the economy as some Keynesians might suggest, but because it induced the government to increase the top tax rate. When the United States began preparing for war in the late 1930s and entered the war in 1941, it had to raise the tax rates on the wealthy in order to fund the war effort. They couldn't just tax the working class since the working class didn't really have any money, so they raised the top tax rates. By 1944, they had raised the top tax rate to 94%. It is true that government spending for the war created jobs and helped to stimulate the economy, but it was the increase in tax rates that led to rising wages for the working class and allowed the economy in general to recover so that the 1950s could be the booming 1950s. The war and government spending only helped this situation insofar as they effected a redistribution of wealth downwards, thereby counteracting the immiseration effect. Starting in the mid-1970s, the top tax rates were reduced under Richard Nixon. These tax cuts have never been undone. American wages have not risen since these tax cuts went into effect. The Trump tax cuts are going to exacerbate this problem, making another Great Depression nearly unavoidable, and will ensure that American wages won't rise in the foreseeable future. Henry Ford was an advocate of paying workers enough to buy the product. At the end of the day, the workers are also consumers. If all of the businessmen in an economy begin to pay subsistence-level wages so that the working class majority cannot afford to purchase luxury items, then the economy will enter into a depression. If the workers can't afford to buy things, the economy will go bad. That's essentially what causes recessions. There are many different factors that contribute to the creation of situations wherein the consumers cannot afford to purchase the products they produce. I am aware of the other contributing factors to recessions and depressions, but the role of monetary and fiscal policy in allowing wealth to trickle upwards is by far the most significant factor. Economic recessions have several causes and contributing factors. So I do not mean by this to be seen as contradicting classical Ricardian, Austrian, and monetarist theories of the business cycle, nor do I mean to be seen as contradicting the analysis of economists like Henry George. Most business cycle theories are correct, but incomplete. Contraction of the money supply, malinvestment sparked by artificially low interest rates, and foreclosures are all contributing factors, all of which lead to more money concentrated in the hands of a few people at the top and less income for the average working class people that make up the majority of the populace. The recession occurs because there is a lack of spending or a substantial reduction in spending as a result of the general populace becoming poorer in real terms. When the average consumer or worker becomes poorer, aggregate demand falls, creating a general glut as the consumers fail to buy up all the products that they produced as workers. As a result of the decrease in aggregate demand, industries will start cutting back on production and laying off workers. As a result of conservative economic policies, we end up with recessions, stagnant real wages, and high real unemployment. It perplexes me that many Trump supporters are upset about Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell trying to cut Social Security and Medicare, when it is Donald Trump more than anyone else that is most responsible for the sabotaging of Social Security. These are programs that we paid for with our tax dollars, but now they are trying to deny us those benefits that we have already paid for. In reality, it is Trump's tax reform that laid the foundation for cutting Social Security and Medicare. Under Bush and Obama, Congress borrowed trillions from the Social Security Trust Fund to fund bailouts and tax cuts for the wealthy. This wasn't stealing from Social Security by any means. It's a trust fund, so that money gets invested. As long as they pay it back and pay the interest, the trust fund is working the way it is supposed to. Fast forward to today. Trump's tax reform gave temporary tax cuts to the middle class, but permanent tax cuts to the wealthy. The super wealthy folks who got subsidized with our Social Security money under Bush and Obama should have to pay higher taxes in order to pay back the money they received from the government. But Trump is a crony capitalist. He doesn't want himself and his friends to have to pay society back for the subsidies and the bailouts of yesterday. Since wealthy billionaires like Trump have bought the politicians, the politicians are actually talking about cutting Social Security and Medicare. The truth is that Trump is responsible for this nonsense. He is responsible for this nonsense about cutting Social Security because he is refusing to make his crony capitalist buddies pay back the money that they took from us. Even if they don't pay back the money, Social Security still has a surplus and can continue to pay 100% of benefits until 2037, at which point it would only be able to cover 75% of the benefits. A slight increase in taxes or a slight decrease in benefits would solve this problem. A mere 2% increase in the payroll tax, for example, would be sufficient to pay 100% of benefits for the next 75 years. Social Security and Medicare are not running out of money, and there's basically no possibility of Social Security becoming insolvent unless politicians actively decide to sabotage it. The politicians being bought and owned by wealthy individuals and corporations do have a motive to sabotage Social Security. They want to sabotage Social Security and scrap the whole program. If they cut Social Security, then these politicians no longer have to tax the wealthy in order to make them pay back the money that they borrowed in order to bail out big business and subsidize big corporations. It is sometimes argued that the federal deficit and debt are too large and that cutting Social Security is necessary to balance the budget. This is totally untrue. Social Security is paid for from a trust fund and is off budget. So it does not contribute to the deficit or to the federal debt at all. In fact, Social Security has a surplus which is invested in U.S. Treasuries, which actually enable the government to borrow less from other places, thereby reducing deficit spending. Social Security is the most fiscally responsible program that the federal government has, and it actually has a positive impact on the budget. Cutting Social Security and Medicare would absolutely result in lives being lost, as many elderly people would lose both their income and their health insurance. The people that currently benefit from these programs and who would be harmed most by cutting these programs overwhelmingly vote Republican. This is a classic example of people voting against their own interests. When it comes to federal debt, 18% of treasuries are owned by Social Security, 17% are owned by the Federal Reserve Banks, and 10% are owned by the Federal Employee Retirement Pension Fund. So 45% of the United States federal debt is owed to the United States. This means that fears about government debt being too large are exaggerated. If you owe money to yourself, it's not a problem. 28% of the federal debt reflects that the government has had surpluses in one area and used that money to fund things in another area. The 17% of the debt that is held by the Fed has actually effectively been written off. The Fed printed the money to buy the treasuries. The Federal Reserve is the bank of the Treasury, so their profits are remitted back to the Treasury. This means that when the Treasury pays interest on U.S. debt held by the Fed, the money is remitted back to the Treasury. The two transactions cancel each other out. The Fed and the Treasury have effectively canceled a large portion of the federal debt via quantitative easing. Taking these facts into consideration, the federal debt in real terms is probably less problematic now than it has ever been in the history of the United States. The American immigration system is broken. Donald Trump knows nothing about the immigration system and has done nothing to fix it. Trump's border wall is estimated to cost $25 million per mile. Meanwhile, the vast majority of illegal immigrants didn't just sneak across the border. They came into the country legally and simply overstayed their visas. Thus, Trump's border wall will have virtually no deterrent effect on illegal immigration. And Trump's insistence on building this expensive and useless wall without raising taxes to fund it will inevitably contribute to further inflation. Visa overstays skyrocketed after 2008 when Obama cracked down on immigration. It's a little known fact that the Obama administration was actively deporting far more people than the Trump administration has been. It just never made the news because Republicans don't care about immigrants, and Democrats didn't want to criticize a Democratic president. Previously, people had been able to get visas, come in, they would leave when the visa expired, and they would be able to come back in again legally in the future. Obama's policies made it more difficult to come back legally after leaving. So many people stopped leaving when their visas expired for fear that they'd never be able to come back. As a result of these shitty policies, staying illegally became the most feasible path to citizenship, and it was a better route than trying to go through the proper channels. Trump doesn't understand the problems with the American immigration system, so his proposed solutions are not only ill-informed, but will also result in real harm and even death to immigrants. His proposed solutions are ineffective and an irresponsible waste of money. The immigration system is broken, and there are definitely policies that could be implemented to fix it. But Trump is more concerned with using immigrants as a scapegoat and as a scary talking point to win votes. One of Trump's other anti-immigrant proposals is to end chain migration and move to a merit-based system. Specifically, he wants to end petitions for residency and citizenship based on relatives. The existing system allows an American citizen to petition for a spouse or other relative to become a legal resident, the first step towards citizenship. Trump's merit-based system would likely make it necessary to prove that one either has a lot of money or can be expected to make a lot of money in the future in order to be eligible to legally immigrate to America. This proposal is unjust because it discriminates against the poor. Furthermore, this policy would actually cut legal immigration by up to 44% and increase illegal immigration. By making legal immigration more difficult or impossible for most people, just as Obama did, Trump will be encouraging more illegal immigration. The migrant caravan was a huge talking point leading up to the midterms. Then suddenly Republicans stopped talking about it as much right after the election. Startlingly, virtually no one on the American right knows anything about immigration. People say that these people need to go through the right process and do it legally if they want to apply for asylum. Well, coming to America is the first step in the asylum process under the existing system. You cannot apply for asylum from outside of the United States. Some people have went so far as to say that the people in the migrant caravan should be shot for the crime of crossing the border. But in reality, being an illegal immigrant is not a crime. It is neither a felony nor a misdemeanor, but rather a civil infraction. Furthermore, marching yourself to the border to apply for asylum actually is, under the existing immigration system, the proper way to apply for asylum. If someone is an illegal immigrant seeking asylum, it usually means that they can reasonably be expected to be killed if they are sent back. The current policy is for people to be deported back to their country of origin if their asylum packet is rejected. This, for many asylees, is a death sentence. Beyond just the asylum seekers, many immigrants from predominantly Muslim countries cannot safely return to their country because extremists will kill them. Christians, feminists, Buddhists, and queers are all coming to America because their country of origin will kill them. Deportation, in many cases, is a death sentence, and that ought not to be taken lightly.